Hello there, YouTube. It's the second time I've tried recording this because it sounded like I was lisping for the first video. It appears as if I've cut my mouth. On closer inspection, I've chewed the inside of my mouth while I was sleeping last night. So this just goes to show how awful the human body just generally is, that we can just decide to eat our own face while we sleep. So if I sound a bit weird in this video, I apologise. This is going to be the first in what I expect is going to be quite a long series of videos, because I own an embarrassingly large number of books at this point, especially given how few of them I've read. I own well over 300 books. I think it's approaching 400 at this point. But I've stopped buying new books. I haven't bought new books in a good long while. I've still been buying books, but I've not been buying new books. Instead, the money that I would have earmarked for buying new books, I've been putting aside, and when I have enough, I buy a luxury book. I buy a leather-bound book or a cloth-bound book. I have quite a few now, and I've been doing this so that I can have my favourites on display in my living room. As you can see, my front door is there. It's got a lot of glass panelling, so there's a lot of natural light coming in. So that's my front door. As you come in, there's the sofa I'm sitting on. There's another sofa over there, and there's the TV straight ahead. To the side of the TV, there is a skinny case with all of my games in it. And then to the other side, there is a corner cabinet, and that has my leather-bound books. That cabinet is positioned so that it is very prominent in my living room. So I want to be able to display really nice editions of books that mean something to me. Books that I feel are valuable and worthwhile. Not just valuable monetarily, but valuable from a personal perspective. Valuable because their content means something to me. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to go over all of the different books on those shelves. So that's going to be this video. And then I've got other areas. Now that's going to be other videos. So that cabinet's what I'm going to go over. As I organise what I'm going to be doing with my paperbacks, I'll go through all of those and you'll be able to see what's on those shelves later. So those are going to be for a different video. So that's going to be my paperback collection. That's almost certainly going to be a two-parter because I have hundreds of them. And I'm not going to have all of them on the shelves because they physically can't fit. There's no way. I would need twice as much shelving space to fit all of the books I own. So what's going to be up there is going to be the books I've actually read and the books that I intend to read soon. The prominent books that I'm focusing on. So that's what you're going to see. And finally, upstairs, I have a small bookcase by the bed, which has a couple of additional collector's editions, leather-bound, so that I have near the bed that I don't have space for in this cabinet, and some of which are duplicates or stuff that I'm enjoying just flicking through in bed. So there's a couple of books up there, which I'll go over again in a separate video. So, without wasting any more of your time, let's have a little look at what's actually on the shelves, shall we? I literally could have recorded that any time, but no, I actually did stop recording, get up, move the camera, recorded the shelves, and then sat back down again. I could have just carried on recording and recorded the shelves separately. That would have been more efficient, but no, I had to do it the hard way. I'm not going to talk about everything while I'm standing because I'm still awaiting surgery, and I'm still in a lot of pain, so I can't be standing for prolonged periods. So I'm going to put pictures up so that you can see the books. I've taken photos on my phone, which I took yesterday. The photos actually show kind of a wider angle. The top shelf, for example, you can see a gap at the either side of the books, which you can't really see when you're sitting on the sofa. So it's interesting the way the photos come out. It looks It looks like there's more space on the shelves than there actually is. But that's okay. So, the top shelf. The top shelf, I have some horizontal stacked. It's the only one. It's the only shelf where I do have this, and I have. I'm looking at my phone so that I can read off the titles. I could just read them off there. I mean, I can see them. I can read them from there. But I'm going to go over each one, looking at my phone, so that I can read the small print. Because whilst I can read it, they're not lit, and it's a bit dark. So I have Lord of the Flies, and I have Murder in the Orient Express. Lord of the Flies, a classic. I read that years ago. It's one of those classic cautionary tale books that I suspect everyone has an idea what it's about, even if they've not read it. It's been adapted and it's been referenced so many times. I highly recommend it. It's got a lot of interesting things to say about the limits of human endurance, and the fact that its main characters are all kids, I think is fascinating. That they put that moral question onto children, I think makes for a very interesting story. Murder on the Orient Express is the only Agatha Christie that I've read. I would read more, I just haven't ever got round to it. I really enjoyed it. It was an interesting one. I don't know if the end of Murder in the Orient Express is representative of the other books in that series, or whether or not it's an outlier. But it was an interesting end. It wasn't one that I saw coming, though apparently it has been referenced in media many times before, so it's surprising that I didn't already know it, because it's the kind of ending that people tend to just get through osmosis. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but it's the kind of ending people tend to just know through osmosis. It's one of those cultural things that people just tend to know. Next, I have Charles Dickens. And all the books, other than the two horizontal ones on that top shelf, they are all the Canterbury Classic leatherbounds. They are remarkably cheap for what they are. And what they represent is a great collection that looks good for shockingly little money. They have a nice introduction to the author at the beginning and a collection of novels. The print's fairly small, but it's not so small that you can't read it. It's nicely presented. It's a great way of getting a lot of books by an author in a short profile. So I highly recommend them. There are a few that I don't. I don't recommend the Jane Austen book because, frankly, the colour is gaudy. I own it. I actually own it, and I'm looking to get rid of it because I think it looks gaudy. It's this really gaudy pale blue, but it looks out of place. All the others are dark. So if you put them together, it stands out a mile. It looks out of place. It doesn't match. They could so easily have made it just a different colour, and it would have looked much better. But also, the front of the cover for the Jane Austen collection looks extreme. It looks over the top. It doesn't look elegant. It looks childish. And like I say, gaudy. It's one of the few that does. It's also way too thick. It's way, way thicker than any of the other books by a long way. It doesn't need to be that thick, and I can prove it because on the second shelf I have another copy of Jane Austen's complete works, and that one's thinner, and contains an additional book. Anyway, Charles Dickens. That contains The Adventures of Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations, and A Tale of Two Cities. Now, I have not read all of these. I have not read A Tale of Two Cities, and it's been so long since I've read Great Expectations, which I read as a teenager, that I don't remember it. But Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol I have read multiple times, and Oliver Twist is my favourite Dickens. I've seen multiple adaptations, and I find it to be one of those ones that it brings back memories. It's a very nostalgic one for me, because it was one that I saw adaptations of when I was very little, and then I read the book. Because I'd already seen adaptations, I vaguely knew the story anyway. So it's one of those ones that I've always had an attachment to. And A Christmas Carol, again, is a story that everyone kind of knows to osmosis. I've seen multiple adaptations, I've read the book multiple times. It's one of those stories that's always going to stick with me. So those two mean a hell of a lot to me. Great Expectations, again, I remember reading it, but I remember very little of it, so I really should go back to it. But Charles Dickens, there's others I've read of Charles Dickens that aren't in that collection, and I would love for Canterbury Classics to do a second volume of Charles Dickens, because there's a few that I have read that aren't in here, like Hard Times and the Pickwick Papers, which I would like to see in here. There's another one as well that I haven't read that everyone seems to recommend, which is David Copperfield. So that's one I'd like to look into. And I'd like to have a matching pair of Charles Dickens. So if they made a volume 2, I'd gladly buy that. The next one I've got is F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby and Other Works. I have not yet opened this book. It's on the shelf, I've not opened it. I don't even know what other works are in here yet. The Great Gatsby is one of his shorter works. So I don't know what else is in here. I will open it up and I'll check it out and review it on this channel at some point. At which point we'll discover together what's in here. But The Great Gatsby is one of those ones where I'm only familiar with it from the film. So it'll be interesting to see what I make of the book. It's supposedly the great American novel, but it's barely longer than a novella. So I'm interested to see what differences there are. Apparently the book and the film have a few key differences, but they're fairly similar in tone. So I should get on with it fairly well. Next I have Mark Twain. Now Mark Twain's an interesting one for me because Mark Twain is one that we don't get exposed to in schools here in Britain. But you do in America, and my audience is majority American. When I speak to my audience, I'm assuming a lot of things. And one of the major things I can assume my audience, because I get statistics if I go on the YouTube Studio app, is that you're probably American and you're probably aged between 30 and 40, because the vast majority of my audience are. Gender dynamics actually evenly split between men and women, but the vast majority of you, something like almost 80% of you are American, and more than 70% of you are aged 30 to 40. So that's interesting. But Mark Twain is not well known in Britain. I mean, amongst readers, academics, yes, but the general public, no. Mark Twain is taught in schools in America because American author, but not in Britain. And it's a very different experience reading Mark Twain when you're British, because we don't have this connection to race that you have in America. So Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Prince and the Pauper, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and I can't read that one because it's blurry. I think that's The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, which is one I've not read. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is by far my favourite. And that's because that is one of the examples of Mark Twain's kind of flirting with sci-fi. He was playing around with the idea of time travel. Mark Twain was very, very interesting because he was a very liberal-minded person at a very, very early time in history. Very, very liberal-minded. Very opposed to slavery, to apartheid, to things along those lines. He was also a very skeptical person. He was a very scientific literalist, and he was an outspoken atheist, which is not common in America. And for an American academic, especially one as well respected as Mark Twain, he is very much an outlier. It's fascinating looking at how Mark Twain's writing is perceived, because everyone focuses on the race aspect. No one seems to focus on the fact that he's very much trying to push a skeptical, scientific outlook to everything. His approach to race was less about liberalism and more about the skeptical analysis. His approach to liberalism was less that it was morally right to treat people based on skin differences as equals because they are equal, but more that it was logically correct, that there is no scientific reason why anyone should ever be a racist. To do so just marks you as an idiot. It wasn't moral reprehensibility. He just considered everyone who was racist to be provably stupid, because only an idiot would make those judgments. And I find that fascinating as a person. He found idiocy to be one of the most annoying and aggravating things in society, and he pushed back against it. He wanted to educate the world, and he was very forceful in that. He got a lot of people's backs up, and when he managed to get himself into a lot of high class parts of society, and he would rile people up and cause a lot of arguments. Mark Twain was a fascinating person. So yeah. Next, I've got the Brothers Grimm, the Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales. That one is one that I highly recommend reading through. There's dozens and dozens of fairy tales in there. There's also the Hans Christian Andersen one, which isn't on the shelf. I do own it. It isn't on the shelf for the same reason that the Jane Austen one isn't on the shelf, and that is that it's an absolutely gaudy, horrible colour. It is bright baby blue and looks awful. So yeah, I would gladly put it next to the Brothers Grimm if it didn't look stupid. So it's not on the shelf, and it won't be on the shelf because it looks gaudy, and it's got this really stupid cartoon frog on the front, which makes it really stand out. It doesn't look elegant. It doesn't look nice. The content is fine, and I would love to have the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales alongside the Grimm's fairy tales, because I believe that the two combined are a complete set. The Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen combined are the foundation of fairy tales. But I can't put it on the shelf. It stands out and it looks awful. It just looks awful. So yeah, it's not on the shelf for that reason. And aesthetics matter. I've got to look at this. It's in my living room. I've got to look at it. And if there's this big baby blue book just staring at me, no. So next I have the selected works of the Bronte sisters, and that contains Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and I can't remember which one, what the third book is, but it's one of Anne Bronte's books. But yes, it's one I've not read. I've read Wuthering Heights. I've not read the others yet. Wuthering Heights was a book that I struggled with, actually, because it was me reintroducing myself to reading classics, and I struggled with the way it was written. I struggled with the prose. The prose I found a bit too anachronistic, and I had to slow my reading speed right down. I found a lot of value in it. It's not a book I would go back to quickly, but I can see what the book's purpose is and why people value it. So it's on the shelf because I can understand its value, and it's also on the shelf as a personal reminder, because whilst I don't particularly enjoy the books, I do enjoy what it forces me to do, and that is improve my literary skills. I need to get better. I need to improve my my vocabulary. I need to improve my ability to work with older prose, because I want to be able to enjoy all of these older books, and I can't enjoy them if the only prose I can digest with any reasonable level of understanding is stuff written in the last 50 years. So, yeah, that's one of the reasons it's on that shelf. Next is the Tales of Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft is one of my, I wouldn't say favourites, but one of my most returned to authors. Not because I find him to be an author that I particularly love, but more because his influence is so far-reaching. Not necessarily in books, but in other media. In film and video games, Lovecraft is possibly the single most influential person ever. And I say that honestly. Like, Lovecraft's work is the single most influential work ever outside of literature. People think, oh yeah, the most influential works is going to be something like Shakespeare. Yeah. Sure, maybe Shakespeare is the most influential work in literature. Lovecraft transcends literature. Lovecraft influences film and video games, especially video games. You will not find anything that influences video games more than Lovecraft. And when I say that, I really do mean that, because the other things that tend to influence video games are films. So there'll be other things like, for example, the Aliens franchise. The film franchise influences video games a lot. But the Aliens franchise was heavily influenced by Lovecraft. So that's just Lovecraft again. Lovecraft is one of those personalities where you need to understand him to appreciate video games. If you are a gamer and you haven't read Lovecraft, read Lovecraft. Now, H.P. Lovecraft is fascinating because he has three main aspects to him. And that is, he has a fear of the other, the unknown. And it's very well described in a lot of the games and things like that that are influenced by his work. He has a severe inferiority complex, and that's worked well into his mythos. But then the last one is his extreme racism, and he is an extreme racist. He does not trust anyone outside of his own group, and it's not even just down to things like black people or Asian people. It's almost anyone, like other white people that are not the white people he's used to, are still subject to his racist opinions. And the thing is, he's not actually a racist if you look at it. It's not racism, it's just his fear of the other. He doesn't hate people for their races, he hates anything that's the other, and races count as the other. He would hate you not just for your race, but for anything that is outside of his norm. So he would likely also be quite a homophobe. He would almost certainly have issues with disabilities. He would probably find strange accents or affectations or anything like that to be really disturbing. If you had a mental illness, that would definitely disturb him. Mental illnesses always did. Lovecraft was disturbed by anything that wasn't the norm. He found the othering to be upsetting, and race was just one of the things that was the other. So he didn't hate race specifically, he hated the othering. And whereas I hate othering for what it does, I don't like how othering others people. He hates the other, and he actively did the othering. So that's why I like reading Lovecraft, because he actively did the thing that I hate. And that means that getting into his mind exposes the kind of thought processes that I hate. And that's fascinating. If you want to understand the people that you find deplorable, you need to understand what makes them tick, what they find disturbing and fearful. If you're afraid of racism, for example, the best thing you can do is understand a racist, because then you understand why they feel the way they do. I think if more people understood Lovecraft, they would understand why there is such a pushback against multiculturalism in a lot of places. Now, I say that as well as someone who is openly anti-immigration and openly anti-multiculturalism. I hate racism, but I'm also very anti-immigration and anti-multiculturalism, because I believe that it is the job of the state to look after its own citizens. It's not your country or your society's job to take in the wastes and strafes of the entire fucking world. You have to look after your own before you start looking after everyone else, because resources are finite, and if you let everyone in, you're not going to be saving everyone else, you're just going to be ensuring that you also live in the same squalor they're currently living in. You don't help anyone that way. Especially if you're a small country. If you're a small country and you start letting in thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees and migrants, all you're going to do is ensure that your country ends up in the same shithole that their country is. Because they're going to drag down the quality of your country because the resources won't stretch. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't let anyone in. Now, I'm getting into politics, of course. That doesn't mean you shouldn't let anyone in. You should consider what resources you can. Have a compassionate policy where you let people in according to what resources you can spare. That's what compassion is. But opening the borders and letting everyone in, that doesn't work. All you end up with is a swarm of people who strip everything bare, and then there's nothing for anyone, because you can't feed 50 people on a meal for 5. That's the way that you have to be responsible with these kinds of policies. A lot of people look at this issue black and white. Reading Lovecraft makes this issue much more digestible, much more interesting, because you can see the reactionary, you can see the othering in Lovecraft's perspective, and you can avoid that, because that is a disturbing reaction. That is the fear made manifest. That if you're reading Lovecraft and you are relating to it, you are allowing fear to take you over. You don't want to think like Lovecraft. You want to think in more practical, realistic terms. If you still have practical, realistic reasons for, say, disagreeing with immigration policies, that's reasonable. But if your reasons sound like they could come out of Lovecraft's mouth, then you might want to reconsider. So, that's my little political rant done. H.G. Wells is next. H.G. Wells, classic of sci-fi there. There's The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, The First Man on the Moon, and The Food of the Gods. And I do apologise, I'm aware that those are really blurry in the photo I've got up there. I know that you can't quite read them. But that's what's there. I've only read some of these. I should really go back and read the others. I've only read The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. I haven't read the other 3. And what I have read are obviously his 3 most popular ones, the ones that have had adaptations, the ones that are pushed by society, because they're probably his best, they're his best known. That doesn't mean they are his best. Maybe his others are even better, and they've just never been really given any chance, any time to present themselves. You never know. But H.G. Wells was one of the first to push these ideas, the concept of alien invasions, of time travel and things like that. He examined these ideas and made them more mainstream. And yeah, him along with the next one in this list, Robert Louis Stevenson, who did something similar. Again, he's known very, very much for Treasure Island, which is the first in the list. I've only read 2 of the ones from this list, which is Treasure Island and A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The others I've not read yet, and I can't quite read them from here. And again, it's too dark for me to read it on from there. I know there's The Black Arrow. I know that there's Prince Ditto, I believe it says, or something like that. Kidnapped is another one. But there's a few on there. And I would like to go ahead and read them, because Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde give a good idea as to what Robert Louis Stevenson is all about. Jekyll and Hyde is a classic of psychological examination, as well as that little bit of urban sci-fi. It's low-end sci-fi, because the sci-fi element, the idea of mixing this elixir that changes his personality, it's not really that important of an element that it's science fiction. It could easily just be a magic potion and it would have the same effect. It's more of a psychological study. And Treasure Island is way more of a just straight a straight adventure novel in the same vein as things like Gulliver's Travels. Robert Louis Stevenson, whilst he delves into a little bit of sci-fi, he's more of the adventure and more traditional story, whereas H.G. Wells went way more into the sci-fi. Classics either way, and definitely recommend both of them. Next we have Jack London, and this is the only time where I can genuinely say there is a book on that shelf where I have read absolutely nothing on that list. Jack London's works, I only recently got that one. It's the most recent one I've added to the shelf. I have read absolutely nothing there. It just says selected works. I know that The Call of the Wild and White Fang are both in there, which are short works. I don't know anything about Jack London other than he was a friend and admirer of Mark Twain. who lived around the same time, younger than Mark Twain, and that's pretty much all I really know. That he moved up to Alaska at some point, and he wrote like classic American adventure novels. So that's kind of what I'm expecting. I have not read any of them, but I'm interested to see what they're about, and it was another one of the Canterbury Classics to add to my collection. I had a little bit of space on the shelf, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to give Jack London a try, because I've not read anything by him, and it's someone else to delve into. So that's the first shelf, and that's taken way longer than I thought it was going to. This may well be a two-parter, guys. Okay, so that's the first shelf. Shelf 2. Shelf 2, I have a mix. These are not Canterbury Classics. Obviously, the first shelf was all Canterbury Classics, except for the two that were horizontal. They were both Folio Society. So, shelf 2 was the top shelf is all Canterbury Classics and two Folio Societies. Shelf 2 is a bit different. These are a mixture of various different books. I think they're mainly Barnes and Noble. I have two Folio Society books on this shelf, one either end. And as you can see, I've tried to make it so that the colours blend, because one of the things about this shelf is it's supposed to have an aesthetic to it. It's supposed to be pleasant to look at. And Something Wicked This Way Comes makes that aesthetic extremely bloody difficult by being bright fucking yellow. So, trying to find somewhere where that damn book would fit is hard as hell. However, it's bright yellow with little bits of red, so thankfully it doesn't look completely ridiculous next to the Jules Verne book, which is red with bits of gold. It can kind of work next to it. It doesn't look completely ridiculous. So, Something Wicked This Way Come, Ray Bradbury. I would gladly get more Ray Bradbury. There's loads of Ray Bradbury I want. I'd love to get Fahrenheit 451, the Folio Society edition. It's out of print. It's ridiculously priced on eBay, and there doesn't appear to be any available, even if it's not ridiculously priced. Ray Bradbury tends to make dystopian, somewhat politically themed books, but this is more of a psychological horror. I suppose not even psychological in some respects, just straight horror in other aspects. Something Wicked This Way Comes is really, really well written. The prose is beautiful. I highly recommend it. It's one of my favourite books on the shelf. It's gorgeous. The cover is beautiful. I've shown it off on camera before. The illustrations are gorgeous. But the story itself is just a joy to read. It's one of those that's a bit on the heavy side, so you've got to be prepared for it, but yeah, well worth going for. Next, I have the Jules Verne 7 novels. This was one that I've mentioned previously. I mentioned that I had the Jules Verne book for Canterbury Classics, which is now not on the shelf. That one's now upstairs on the shelf in the bedroom, because I now have the 7 novels Jules Verne book, as you can see. Because the one that I had was missing one of my favourite Jules Verne books. So now I have the 7 novels book, which has all the Jules Verne books I care about. And yeah, I feel much happier having that one because I wanted to have access to everything. Jules Verne, I think, is one of the most important classics of sci-fi. It's one that you can't really ignore if you want to have a good if you want to have a good foundation in the basics of sci-fi. So, I'd seek out Jules Verne. A lot of what Jules Verne has written doesn't seem like sci-fi anymore. It feels almost like reading fantasy now, because it's based in a time when what was sci-fi then has now been either disproven or shot straight past. So, what has been described in these books is fantastical from our perspective, but it was sci-fi from the perspective of the writer and the people of the time. So it's a fascinating read. Next to Jules Verne, I have the complete Sherlock Holmes. I've read very little Sherlock Holmes. I've only read Study in Scarlet and a couple of the short stories. So I need to go through and read more Sherlock Holmes because there's a lot of Sherlock Holmes that I would like to read. and this is one of the nicest Sherlock Holmes collections. I did have the Canterbury Classics Sherlock Holmes, which is giant and has a really ugly sticker on the front cover. It looks like it's just a design. It's a sticker. It's just someone's just whacked a sticker on a leather band and it ruins the book completely. It looks awful. It looks cheap and nasty. So I do not recommend getting the Canterbury Classics complete Sherlock Holmes. I will compare the two. But yeah, the sticker just ruins the book. And it makes the book look awful. It's a sandy brown, so it doesn't really look as good on the shelf with all the other Canterbury Classics, which are, again, much darker. But it's also a bigger book than this. It's a thicker book, which it doesn't need to be. So this is the nicer book of the two. It's got all the same stuff in it, but that's why I've got it on the shelf there, out of the two books I own. Like I say, I'll be comparing them in another video. And then have the Anne Rice, The Vampire Chronicles. This is a very recent edition. I added this only about a week ago, in fact. And that's because this showed up on Amazon for £18. Given that it was on eBay for 150 quid a few months ago, £18, there was no way in hell I was letting that go. You can't buy the paperbacks that cheap. This has the first three books. So, Interview with the Vampire Lestat, and Queen of the Damned. And basically, that's all you need to read from the Vampire Chronicles. You don't read past the first three. The first three is a trilogy. You read them and you stop. Because Anne Rice just trails off and goes off at the deep end. Like, the books get progressively worse and worse. But the first three are genuinely great books, and I believe that Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles is the preeminent work of vampire literature. I know people talk about Dracula. Honestly, Dracula is boring. I've read Dracula. It's not that worthwhile. Vampire Chronicles, on the other hand, is what vampire fiction should be. It makes the vampires mysterious and interesting, and it gives them a sense of foreboding. Like, I find this way more evocative than anything Dracula based. So, Vampire Chronicles, highly recommend. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy is the next book on the shelf, and that's one I've not read. I've seen adaptations of Anna Karenina, but I've not read it yet. Same with the next book, Les Miserables. Again, Victor Hugo, not read this book either. So why do I have two big prominent books on my shelf that I've not read? I have seen adaptations of each. Well, that's because of the next book on the list. That is the Jane Austen's 7 novels. The reason that I own Anna Karenina and Les Mis in these nice collectible editions is because I was looking to replace my gaudy, awful Jane Austen collection from the Canterbury Classics. I like the Canterbury Classics collection, it's why I have a whole shelf of Canterbury Classics. But some of them just look awful. And the Jane Austen one is one of them. I had to replace it. When I was looking at replacing it, I was considering getting the cloth-bound Penguin Classics. But you have to buy them individually. Then I considered a collection of Jane Austen, I think they're leather-bound hardbacks that were produced by Arcturus, but they were more than 50 quid for the box set. Then I found this. Now, I was looking at the cloth-bound books. They were about seven per book for 7 novels, which is again more than 50 quid. But this big leather-bound book, plus Les Mis, plus Anna Karenina, as a set, all 3 of them, was on sale, brand new, on an eBay auction, for £38. Buy it now. For all 3. You couldn't buy Jane Austen's books for that. In paperback. So for £38, I got all 3 of those big leather-bound books, brand new, still in the cellophane. I couldn't pass that up, so I bought them all. I thought, for that price, I would be a fool not to buy them if those are the kind of books that I'm looking for. So yeah, I bought those, and they're now on the shelf. I'm going to have to read them because they're very prominent. They're in the middle of the shelf. I know that the stories are interesting and intriguing. I have had Les Mis and Anna Karenina recommended to me many, many times. So these are books that I want to read. But now they're on my shelf, if I don't read them, they are staring at me, and they're bright, they're white. Right? They blend nicely because I'm going from like a red through this lighter into white into this light blue. So it works on the shelf. But there are white the white books on the shelf, so they stare right at me, reminding me we're right here on your shelf of books that are supposed to represent you, and you haven't read us yet. So get on it. So yeah, I'm gonna have to spend some time with these books. So those 2 are on the list to be read very, very soon. Jane Austen. Now, I've not read all of Jane Austen. I know, everyone says that you have to read all of Jane Austen because Jane Austen is this big thing in classic literature. And fair enough, I suppose. I'm not going to claim that that's wrong, but what I will say is that Jane Austen represents the kind of classic literature that, whilst I would like to be able to get into, I'm not a big reader of romance, so I can only read a little bit at a time. I did enjoy Emma. Emma, I've thoroughly enjoyed. Pride and Prejudice, I was not a fan of, but I read it years ago, and I've seen an adaptation that I really didn't like all that much. I didn't dislike it, but I didn't like it either. But it was just there. It wasn't really my thing, but it was years ago. I really should give it another try. So Jane Austen is one of those things where I've dipped my toe in, but I'd like to give her more of a try. My sister loves Jane Austen, my mum loves Jane Austen. I've had loads of people say I need to read more Jane Austen, so I'm going to try. I don't dislike Jane Austen. Emma, I thought, was really, really enchanting as a book. It's funny, it's endearing, it's a really nice story. I really enjoyed the recent film adaptation as well. I thought they did a good job of taking that book and transferring it to film. They kept a lot of it intact, so that worked well. Finally on that shelf I have Arthur C. Clarke, Rendezvous with Rama. So, Arthur C. Clarke is one of those authors that has caused the space opera classic sci-fi to be what it is today, and has influenced so much of the media that I enjoy. Things like Star Trek owes a lot to the grandfathers of sci-fi, like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. And whilst I don't have any Asimov on this shelf, I do have Asimov on my shelf in the bedroom. Arthur C. Clarke, I feel, has influenced more of the classic space opera. So something like Star Trek, is very Clarkian in the way it approaches a lot of sci-fi tropes and styles. There's a lot of principles that are first examined in Arthur C. Clarke's work, and Rendezvous with Rama is one of those examples. Probably one of his best known, so that's why that one's on there. Right. The last shelf. The last shelf is where my most expensive and most sought after books are, because this is where it is almost all Folio Society books, and expensive Folio Society books at that. Admittedly, these were gifts, so I didn't buy them, because I can't afford to buy these books. First there is George R. R. Martin's A Game of Thrones. Now, I only own the first one of A Song of Ice and Fire in Folio. I am hoping to get more. Christmas is coming up, I suspect that I may end up receiving the second book in the series at Christmas, because it's the kind of thing that certain family members will consider getting me. That doesn't mean they will. If they don't, fair enough. But it's the kind of thing that I'm likely to receive, because they know I don't own it, they know I can't afford to buy it for myself, and they know I want it. So it's the kind of thing that if I was to receive it, I wouldn't be surprised. That doesn't mean I'm expecting to receive it, by the way. But I would not be surprised if I did. But at the moment, if I did receive it, by the way, there's no space for it on the damn shelf. So that would be a completely new problem. As you can see, the shelf is full. But yeah, I have a Game of Thrones. Now, I could wax on for another, God knows how long, another 2 hours probably, about A Song of Ice and Fire. It is my favourite series. A Game of Thrones is not my favourite book in the series. It used to be book 2, because I felt that book 2 tied everything together and was the book that made everything, fit together best. But in retrospect, I think it's just that book 2 was the book that I enjoyed reading the most in the moment. Book 3 is the better book. I know it's the better book. I think I was just being a bit contrarian in that when I was reading it, book 2 was the one that, because I didn't read it all that often, book 2 was the one that I got into the most. So it meant a lot to me at the time. But yeah, the third book is the one where the big events happen. So it is the better book of the 3, and I do consider the first 3 books to be a trilogy unto themselves. Books 4 and 5 are less important, and there's a bit of a dip in quality, I feel, in the storytelling. I have come to a realization that it's unlikely that we're ever going to see an end to A Song of Ice and Fire at this point. And I'm okay with the story remaining unfinished, because frankly I don't want to see the ending, if the ending is anything like what happens in the TV show. Because, yeah, if George R.R. Martin gave them notes and they were working off those notes, that means that is potentially the ending he had in mind, and I don't want to see that in book 4. Small spoiler, but at the end of the 5th book, there is a character that is left bleeding out and dying. I am happy to headcanon that as this story is the story arc of that character, and that they die at the end of the book, and that's the end. I'm happy to headcanon it that way. And if you look at it that way, that becomes the tragedy of the story. And that's the end. It's less satisfying, I'll admit, because there's still so many, threads of storyline that just aren't resolved. But I can at least headcanon that that's the way it works. Like, that's life. If you think about life, there are going to be storylines of the world that are ongoing when you die. And it doesn't matter that you're dying. The life and world is going to continue on without you. And you're not going to get to see how it resolves. So, yeah. That's the way it works. Maybe that is the message. So after that we have His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and this is a YA fantasy series that I like to have prominent there, because I feel it's the anti-Narnia, and I'm not a big fan of Narnia. I know that people put it up as the child equivalent of Lord of the Rings. It's like there's Lord of the Rings and there's Narnia. And those two are considered like the classics of fantasy fiction. Lord of the Rings is the big one, and then there's Narnia for the kids. And Narnia is not good. Have you read it recently? It's not good. There's a reason that Chronicles of Narnia does not appear on people's top 100 lists anymore. Like, if you look at like the best of fantasy, Narnia barely cracks the top. It barely makes the list. It's often only included in there for nostalgia reasons, or it's included there as a must include. It is not included because it's actually entered its position. Although I'm now beginning to suspect that that's happening for Lord of the Rings a lot as well, that it's included as an auto-include, out of nostalgia or out of necessity. A lot of people who haven't even read it will just include Lord of the Rings because they feel they have to. So Lord of the Rings gets massively, massively overinflated in those kinds of rankings as well. That's not to say Lord of the Rings isn't good, but I'm not a big fan of Lord of the Rings. I'm not going to claim I am. There's a reason I haven't been making Rings of Power content. Yeah, that would surely bring in hundreds of thousands of views because everyone loves watching people bitch about terrible TV adaptations of beloved franchises. But I'm not a fan of Lord of the Rings, and for me to pretend I am would be disingenuous, which is kind of what a lot of people who are being paid by Amazon are doing right now. Pretending to be fans of Lord of the Rings. I have Lord of the Rings, I have the book, it's over there. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not going to pretend to be a big fan. I've read it, it's fine. I'm not a big fan of the prose style. I don't like the breaks in the story for the songs and things like that. It kind of just takes things and slows it right down for me, and there's a little too much walking. It's just my personal tastes. I'm not going to claim it's not a good book, because it clearly is. But yeah, that's what I mean. Whereas, for me, there's Lord of the Rings, and there's the anti-Lord of the Rings, which is A Song of Ice and Fire, which I absolutely love. There's Chronicles of Narnia, and then there's the anti-Narnia, which is His Dark Materials, which I absolutely love. I think I'm just contrarian when it comes to fantasy. His Dark Materials feels like the atheist equivalent of Chronicles of Narnia. It takes the messages of Narnia and flips them on their head. And that's what I liked about it. It's a skeptic's fantasy, and it teaches ideas of skepticism and observation, of perspective and self-reliance. It's got a lot of that in it. It's messages that wouldn't have appeared in Narnia, but it's trying to do the same thing Narnia was doing, which was teaching messages of a Christian nature. So Christian values embedded into a fantasy story. This is taking secular values and embedding it into a fantasy story. I think they did a fantastic job of it. Well, I say they. I think Philip Pullman did a fantastic job of it. So yeah, that's on there. Next I have Frank Herbert's Dune, and it's actually the Great Dune Trilogy. So that is the first 3 Dune novels in there. It is a very soft, floppy leatherbound, and I don't know where it was produced. I don't know where that was published. It's a fairly old book. I again found it on eBay really cheap, and went, yeah, I'm having that, because that was just. It was one of those where I saw it, I snapped it up. I think I paid something like £11, and that was a while ago. And I thought, yeah, I'm definitely having that, because that looks like a really interesting, really unique leatherbound. And it is a real leatherbound, but it's very soft, very, very floppy. It's kind of leather you'd make a leather jacket out of. So it feels like you're reading from one of those big floppy paperbacks. Really, really, really nice book. So I'm very pleased with that book. Dune is one of those stories that gets compared to a lot of other things. But again, I think that its influence is one of the main reasons that I'm fascinated by Dune, because it's influenced so much of our media. Like I say, Star Wars would not exist without Dune. Dune has influenced so much of what Star Wars is that Dune is practically the proto-Star Wars. It is more of a political fantasy in space than a true sci-fi, I'd say. But there's definitely enough sci-fi elements for a sci-fi fan. I've only read the first. I've not read the second or the third book, but now that I own the Great Trilogy, I'm going to continue and read more. So Dune is definitely a worthwhile addition to the shelf. The next one, however, is probably one of my all-time favourites, and that's Starship Troopers. Starship Troopers it's such a polarising book, because the way that people perceive the politics, and I'm going to make a whole video dissecting the politics of Starship Troopers, both the book and the film, because they are perceived differently. Because Starship Troopers is one of my all-time favourite films, it's one of my all-time favourite books. It has got to be up there as one of the things that I need to dissect and discuss, simply because it can be read in different manners and different ways, and a lot of people take it to be this endorsement of fascist authoritarianism, and I do not have the same reading, and I think that's a rather unconventional reading. So I'll be interested to see what people make of it. The last one that I have here is The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, which I have tried to read multiple times, and I have got through only half of. This is one hell of a book. It is not easy to get through. It is very, very allegorical. It's not difficult to read, but it's difficult to get to grips with, if that makes sense. There's a lot of bits where you feel you're missing it. You want to keep going back and rereading. So it's not that you struggle to read it, it's that you read it and you keep feeling, I want to go back and reread that bit. So you keep rereading and rereading. It's just got that feel to it. Anyone who's read it knows what I'm talking about. So I've read Shadow and Claw, but I keep wanting to go back and rereading Shadow and Claw, and I don't want to move on because I keep feeling like I'm missing half of Shadow and Claw. And it's not the second half, which I know is sitting in the second volume. But I keep rereading Shadow and Claw and going, I'm not sure I'm picking up what's meant to be picked up here, because it's simpler than it sounds. But there's subtleties there that are missed very easily. It's supposed to be this sci-fi dying Earth story, but it's very obviously not. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy that is pasted on top of a sci-fi universe, the sci-fi lore that this fantasy novel is written on top of. And that is really, really interesting. It's very engaging. I can see why fantasy fans would enjoy it. I can see why sci-fi fans would enjoy it. I do recommend it, but it's not one I'd start with. Not for a lot of people. The only thing I can say is less is harder to get through than those books would be. Malzahn Book of the Fallen. That's the only thing that I can honestly say was more of a challenge to get through than that. So those are the books on my shelf. They all mean something to me. It's not necessarily all books that I am deeply connected to on a personal level that I would want to recommend to everyone, but they're all books that mean something to me on a personal level to some degree. And I feel that they represent who I am as a reader. They represent who I want to be as a reader and who I am as a reader. So those are my books, and that's how I want to present myself. I also have my paperbacks, which again I'm doing a similar thing with, where I'm only putting the books out that I'm both actively wanting to read and that I've actually read. And I'll be going through those in a future video. And you can go through those with me, and we'll be able to have a little play around with them. And I'll go through each book and describe what I think and feel about them. Like I say, because I'm only putting books I've actually read, or books that mean something to me, I can discuss all of these books like I've done with this shelf. It does mean it's going to take a while. Right, well, I'll see you in the next video anyway. I'm going to have a bit of a rest now because I've been talking for about an hour and a half. Right, I'm going to have a lot of editing to do today. That's going to be fun. Right, see you next time. Bye.